Arizona Territory, November 1883. Lonely rancher bought a burnt-out shack for 5 cents at a government land auction. But when he stepped inside and found an Apache widow with her 3 children living in the charred ruins, he froze. What happened next would challenge everything he believed about justice, survival, and the true meaning of home in a territory where mercy was rarer than water, and second chances came at the cost of everything a man held dear. The morning sun cut through the desert air like a blade, casting long shadows across the dusty streets of Tombstone as Ethan Cooper adjusted his worn hat and checked the coins in his pocket one final time. 3 silver dollars, 2 dimes, and a handful of pennies. All that remained of 27 years of drifting from ranch to ranch. From one broken dream to another, he'd ridden into town 3 days ago with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from never having a place to call home. The government land auction was his last hope, a chance to bid on properties abandoned after Apache raids, foreclosed homesteads, and the scattered remains of dreams that hadn't survived the harsh realities of territorial life. The courthouse steps were crowded with men who smelled of tobacco and desperation, their weathered faces scanning auction lists with the intensity of gamblers studying cards. Ethan had studied those same lists for hours, searching for something, anything, that might fit his meager budget. Most of the properties started at $50, fortunes he couldn't imagine possessing. But there, at the bottom of the 3rd page, written in faded ink, was a listing that made his heart race. Charred homestead, 40 acres, Dragoon Mountains vicinity. Structural damage from fire. Starting bid, 5 cents. 5 cents. Less than the cost of a cup of coffee. Less than most men carried in their pockets as an afterthought. The listing mentioned fire damage but provided no other details. No mention of when the fire occurred, how extensive the damage was, or why the government was practically giving the land away. Ethan touched the small leather pouch where he kept his father's compass, the only thing of value he'd ever owned. His father had been a surveyor before the war, a man who believed that every piece of land held possibility if you were willing to work hard enough to find it. The compass had guided Ethan through 2 decades of wandering, always pointing toward a future that seemed just beyond reach. The auctioneer, a thin man with wire spectacles and a voice that carried across the courthouse square, called for attention. Property after property was sold to men with deep pockets and deeper connections. Established ranchers expanding their holdings, businessmen from back east looking for investment opportunities, local politicians securing land for future development. Ethan waited, his palms growing damp as the sun climbed higher and the list grew shorter. When the auctioneer finally called the lot number for the charred homestead, a murmur of disinterest rippled through the crowd. Several men actually laughed, shaking their heads at the audacity of trying to sell burnt ruins. 40 acres in the Dragoon Mountains, structural damage from fire, starting bid 5 cents. The auctioneer announced with the tone of a man going through the motions. Do I hear 5 cents? Ethan's hand shot up before his courage could abandon him. The auctioneer looked surprised, scanning the crowd for other bidders who never materialized. After the required waiting period, the gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the desert. Sold to the gentleman in the brown hat for 5 cents. Men around him chuckled and shook their heads, some offering sarcastic congratulations on his wise investment. But Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in years: ownership. For the first time in his adult life, he owned something more substantial than the clothes on his back. The clerk handed him a deed written on official territorial paper, the government seal pressed into wax that was already cracking in the heat. The property description was vague, mentioning only approximate boundaries and the warning about fire damage. No maps, no surveys, no indication of what he might actually find when he reached the land. As the crowd dispersed and the courthouse square emptied, Ethan studied the deed with the intensity of a man reading his own future. 40 acres, income voici. The Dragoon Mountains, a region he knew only by reputation as Apache territory. Hard country where water was scarce and survival required more luck than skill. But it was his now, purchased with the last of his money and signed in his own name. For 5 cents, he'd bought the chance to stop running, to build something lasting, to prove that a man's worth wasn't measured by his bank account, but by his willingness to fight for a future. The ride to the Dragoon Mountains took 2 days, through country that seemed designed to test a man's resolve. Ethan followed rough wagon tracks that appeared and disappeared like mirages, navigating by his father's compass and the vague directions provided by the courthouse clerk. The land grew more desolate with each mile, dotted with saguaro cacti that stood like ancient sentinels and rocky outcroppings that offered little shade from the relentless sun. His horse, a sturdy mare named Clara that he'd bought with his last steady wages, picked her way carefully through terrain that could lame an animal with one wrong step. On the second day, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Ethan spotted smoke rising in the distance. Not the thick black smoke of a fresh fire, but the thin, wavering line that came from a cooking fire or a chimney. His heart quickened as he realized he was approaching his property, but something was wrong with the picture. According to the auction documents, the homestead had been abandoned after fire damage. There shouldn't be smoke, shouldn't be any signs of life. The government had assured bidders that all properties were vacant and available for immediate occupation. As he crested a small ridge, Ethan got his first look at what 5 cents had bought him. The main structure was indeed damaged by fire. Its roof partially collapsed and its walls blackened by smoke and flame. But someone had made repairs, crude but functional patches that kept out the wind and rain. A small garden plot had been cleared and planted near what remained of the house. Clothes hung on a makeshift line strung between 2 surviving fence posts. A thin column of smoke rose from a chimney that had been rebuilt with stones and mud. Ethan dismounted and approached slowly, his hand resting on the grip of his rifle, not from aggression, but from caution. In Apache territory, surprises could be deadly, and he had no idea who might be living on land he'd just purchased from the territorial government. The sound of children's laughter drifted from behind the damaged structure, incongruous in the harsh landscape. He moved closer, his boots crunching on scattered debris from the fire, until he could see around the corner of the building. 3 children played in the dirt yard, their game involving small stones and a circle drawn in the earth. The oldest, a girl of perhaps 12, had long dark hair braided with colorful threads. 2 boys, one maybe 8 and the other barely school age, chased each other around the circle with the unrestrained joy of children who had learned to find happiness in simple things. But it was the woman who made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. She sat on a wooden crate that served as a chair, mending what looked like a shirt with careful, precise stitches. Her dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and her face carried the kind of strength that came from surviving more than any person should have to endure. She was Apache, that much was clear from her features and the traditional patterns embroidered on her clothing. But what struck Ethan most was the dignity she maintained despite her obvious poverty. The way she held herself like royalty, even while sitting on a box in the ruins of someone else's dream. The moment stretched between them as she looked up and their eyes met across the dusty yard. No fear, no surprise, just the calm assessment of a woman who had learned to read men's intentions in their first glance. The children stopped playing, moving instinctively closer to their mother without being called. Ethan removed his hat, a gesture of respect his mother had taught him before the fever took her when he was barely older than the youngest boy watching him now. He approached slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements non-threatening. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from 2 days of silence. "I don't mean to intrude, but I believe there's been some mistake. I just purchased this property from the territorial government." The woman, who had been studying him with the intensity of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions quickly, set down her mending and stood. When she spoke, Her English was accented but clear, each word chosen with the precision of someone speaking a second language. "There is no mistake," she said quietly. "I am Namid Strongbeer. These are my children. This is our home, Ethan." Felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Not literally, but in the way that happens when a man realizes his simple plan has just become infinitely complicated. He pulled the deed from his coat pocket, unfolding the official document with its government seals and legal language. "The government sold this as abandoned property," he said, holding out the paper. "I paid 5 cents at a land auction in Tombstone. They said it was vacant." Namid's expression didn't change as she glanced at the deed, but something flickered in her dark eyes, a combination of recognition and resignation that suggested this wasn't the first time official documents had threatened her family's security. "The government says many things," she replied. "They said this land would be ours after my husband died fighting their wars. They said Apache families who served the cavalry would be protected. They said our children could grow up in peace." She gestured toward the damaged structure behind her, and Ethan noticed for the first time the careful way the repairs had been made, the attention to detail that spoke of someone who intended to stay despite the odds. "When the fire came, they said we should move to the reservation, that this land was too dangerous for Apache families. But my husband built this house with his own hands before he died. His spirit walks these hills. This is where he wanted his children to grow strong." The oldest child, the girl with braided hair, stepped forward with the protective instinct of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly. She said something in Apache to her mother, words that Ethan couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear in the way she positioned herself between him and the younger boys. "Tala asks if you are here to take our home," Namid translated, her hand resting gently on her daughter's shoulder. "I told her that some men come with papers, others come with guns, but all of them come eventually." Ethan looked at the deed in his hands, at the official seals that gave him legal right to this land, at the 5 cents he'd spent for what he thought was a new beginning. But he also looked at the carefully tended garden, the skillfully repaired walls, the children who had built their games and dreams in this harsh place. "Mrs. Strongbeer," he said finally, folding the deed and putting it back in his pocket. "I think there are some things we need to discuss." What followed was the most important conversation of Ethan's life, conducted in the shade of a ramada that Namid had constructed from salvaged wood and canvas. She served him water from a clay vessel that stayed miraculously cool despite the desert heat, and he found himself listening to a story that put his own struggles into perspective. Namid's husband, Joseph Strongbeer, had been a scout for the U.S. Cavalry, one of the Apache men who had chosen to work with the military rather than fight against the inevitable tide of westward expansion. It was dangerous work that put him at odds with both his own people and the soldiers who never fully trusted him, but it had promised a future for his family. Joseph believed that cooperation was the only path to survival, Namid explained, her voice carrying the weight of old grief. He guided cavalry patrols, helped negotiate treaties, tried to build bridges between two worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. The government had promised land grants to Apache scouts who served faithfully, a chance to establish homesteads where their families could live in peace while maintaining their cultural traditions. Joseph had filed the proper papers, followed all the bureaucratic procedures, and begun building a life for his wife and children on the 40 acres where they now sat. But promises made to Apache families carried little weight when political winds changed. Joseph had been killed in an ambush while scouting for a cavalry patrol, shot by Apache raiders who saw him as a traitor to his people. His death had left Namid with 3 young children and no legal protection for the land they called home. The territorial government said his service record was incomplete. She continued, her hand steady as she worked on her mending despite the emotion in her voice. They said the land grant was invalid, that we had no claim to this place. They ordered us to move to the reservation at San Carlos, but San Carlos was a place where Apache spirits went to die slowly. overcrowded and undersupplied, a concentration of proud people reduced to dependence on government rations. Namid had seen what happened to families who went there, how children lost their language and elders lost their will to live. "I chose to stay," she said simply. "Joseph's spirit walks these hills. His children belong on the land he died protecting. So we stayed and we survived." The fire had come 6 months ago, started by lightning and fed by drought-dry vegetation. It had swept through the area like divine judgment, destroying everything flammable and leaving behind a landscape of ash and blackened stone. The main house had been gutted, their few possessions reduced to smoke and memory. But Namid had rebuilt what she could with salvaged materials and the kind of determination that came from having nowhere else to go. She had replanted the garden with seeds saved from the previous year's harvest. She had patched the roof with whatever she could find and taught her children to see possibility where others saw only destruction. The government declared this land abandoned after the fire. She explained. They said no one could survive here, that it was worthless for settlement. So they put it up for auction, thinking no one would be foolish enough to bid. Ethan felt the weight of understanding settle on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. The territorial government had sold him land that was already occupied by a family who had more moral claim to it than any piece of paper could provide. They had used bureaucratic sleight of hand to solve 2 problems at once, removing an inconvenient Apache family and generating revenue from supposedly worthless property. He looked around at what Namid had accomplished with nothing but will and necessity. The garden was thriving despite the harsh conditions. The repaired house, while humble, was clean and functional. Most importantly, the children moved with the confidence of young people who knew they were loved and protected. "Mrs. Strongbeer," Ethan said finally, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood their importance. "I came here looking for a place to call home. But it seems I found a place that's already home to someone else." Namid studied his face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read character in the lines around a man's eyes and the set of his shoulders. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy some internal test. "There is room for more than one family on 40 acres, she said quietly. "Joseph always said that the land belongs to whoever is willing to work it, protect it, and honor the spirits that dwell within it." Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a sensation like ice cracking after a long winter. For years he had wandered from place to place, working other men's land and sleeping under other men's roofs, always the outsider looking in. But here was a woman offering to share the home she had built from ashes and determination. "What would you need from me?" he asked, the question coming from a part of himself he had thought dead and buried under years of disappointment. Namid smiled for the first time since he had arrived, an expression that transformed her weathered features and revealed the beauty that hardship had tried but failed to diminish. "Help," she said simply. "Help to rebuild what the fire destroyed. Help to protect what we have built. Help to prove that this land can support a family, or perhaps 2 families, who are willing to work together rather than fight over scraps." As the sun began to set behind the Dragoon Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to set the entire world on fire, Ethan Cooper realized that his 5-cent investment had bought him something more valuable than land. It had bought him the chance to be part of something larger than his own small dreams, to help build a future that honored both the past and the hope for tomorrow. The desert night fell fast and cold, as it always did in the high country of the Dragoon Mountains. Ethan found himself sitting by a small fire that Namid had built in a ring of stones, watching sparks drift upward to join the countless stars that stretched across the Arizona sky like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Namid had insisted he stay for supper, a meal of rabbit stew and flatbread that tasted better than anything he'd eaten in the fancy hotels of Denver or San Francisco during his brief attempts at civilized living. The children had warmed to his presence with the adaptability of young people accustomed to sudden changes in their circumstances. Tyla, the 12-year-old daughter, had questioned him with the directness of someone who had learned early that adult promises often proved hollow. Her English was nearly perfect, learned from her father who had believed education would be his children's pathway to survival in a changing world. "Are you going to make us leave?" she had asked during the meal, her dark eyes steady on his face as she waited for an answer that would determine her family's future. And had looked across the fire at Namid, seeing in her expression the careful neutrality of a mother preparing to protect her children from another disappointment. The weight of that moment, of knowing that his next words would either build hope or destroy it, had made his throat dry despite the water she had shared. "I don't know yet," he had answered honestly, because these people deserved truth more than comfortable lies. "But I can promise you this, whatever happens, it won't be decided tonight, and it won't be decided without talking to your mother first." It wasn't the reassurance Tyla had wanted, but it was honest, and apparently honesty carried weight in this family. She had nodded in return to her meal, but he caught her watching him throughout the evening with the assessment of someone learning to judge character in adults who held power over her world. Now, as the fire burned low and the children had been sent to their blankets in the rebuilt portion of the house, Ethan found himself alone with Namid and the magnitude of the decision he faced. The legal deed in his pocket gave him clear ownership of this land, but legal ownership and moral right were proving to be very different things. "Tell me about the fire," he said finally, because understanding the past seemed essential to making decisions about the future. Namid poked at the coals with a charred stick, sending up a shower of sparks that reminded him uncomfortably of the destruction she was describing. "It started in the early morning, before dawn. Lightning had struck a dead pine on the ridge above our house. The wind was strong that day, and it carried the flames faster than we could run." She described the terror of waking to the smell of smoke and the orange glow reflecting off her bedroom wall. Joseph had been dead for almost a year by then, leaving her to make life and death decisions for her family without the partner who had always shared that burden. "I woke the children, and we ran to the creek bed, the only place without fuel for the fire. We watched our home burn from there, everything Joseph had built, everything we had saved for the children's future. Gone in less than an hour." But Namid Strongbeer was not a woman who surrendered to circumstances beyond her control. As soon as the fire had passed and the ground was cool enough to walk on, she had returned to assess what remained and plan what came next. The walls were stone, built to last, so they survived. The roof was gone, most of the interior was ash, but the bones of the house were strong. Joseph had built well, thinking of his grandchildren who might live here someday. She had spent weeks clearing debris and salvaging what could be saved. Nails that weren't too badly warped, pieces of lumber that had escaped the flames, stones from the collapsed chimney that could be rebuilt into something functional. "The government men came while I was working," she continued, her voice carrying a bitter edge that spoke of broken promises and bureaucratic indifference. "They said the land was too damaged for habitation, that we should accept relocation to San Carlos where we would be provided for." But Namid had seen San Carlos, had visited relatives who had been moved there supposedly for their own protection. The reservation was overcrowded and undersupplied, a place where proud Apache families lived in poverty while their children forgot the old ways and learned to depend on government charity. I told them we would stay and rebuild. They said that was impossible, that no one could survive on burned land with no resources. They gave me 30 days to reconsider before they declared the property abandoned. Those 30 days had become 6 months of the hardest work Namid had ever done. With only her children to help and limited tools salvaged from the fire, she had rebuilt walls, patched the roof with canvas and salvaged wood, and replanted the garden with seeds traded from Apache families who still moved freely through the mountains. "They expected us to fail," she said, her voice carrying quiet pride. "They thought hunger and hardship would drive us to the reservation where we would be someone else's problem. But Apache women are stronger than they imagined. Ethan studied her face in the firelight, seeing the strength that had sustained her through months of backbreaking labor and constant uncertainty. She had rebuilt not just a house, but a life, creating stability for her children in a world that seemed determined to sweep them aside. "Why didn't they just force you to leave?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Named's smile was sharp as a knife blade. "Because forcing Apache families off their land creates martyrs, and martyrs inspire resistance. It was easier to let us struggle and fail on our own, than point to our failure as proof that Apache families cannot adapt to modern life." But she hadn't failed, and that success had created a different kind of problem for territorial authorities, who preferred their Indian policy decisions to be clear-cut. A thriving Apache family on productive land complicated the narrative that justified removal and concentration on reservations, so they waited for the fire, Ethan said, understanding dawning like unwelcome sunrise. They waited for disaster to solve their problem for them, and when disaster did not solve it completely, they found another way. They declared the land abandoned and sold it to someone who would presumably force us to leave or die trying. The accusation hung between them like smoke from the dying fire. Ethan realized that from Named's perspective, he was just the latest weapon in a campaign designed to drive her family from their home. A weapon that happened to carry legal documents instead of rifles, but a weapon nonetheless. "What if I'm not?" he asked quietly. "What if I'm just a man who spent his last 5 cents hoping to find a place to belong?" Named studied him with the intensity of someone whose survival had depended on reading people accurately. Whatever she saw in his face seemed to satisfy some internal test. Because her expression softened slightly. "Then perhaps you have found what you were looking for," she said. "But finding it and keeping it are different challenges entirely." Ethan woke before dawn to the sound of movement outside the lean-to shelter Named had constructed for him from salvaged canvas and pine boughs. The desert air was crisp enough to make his breath visible, and the eastern sky was just beginning to show the first hint of gray that preceded sunrise. He dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Named already at work in the garden, using a tool fashioned from a piece of fire-hardened wood to cultivate the soil around plants that somehow thrived in this harsh environment. She worked with the efficiency of someone who had learned to accomplish much in the few hours before the sun made outdoor labor unbearable. "Good morning," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her but also not wanting to seem like he was. Sneaking up on her work, she looked up with no surprise, as if she had been aware of his presence from the moment he stirred. "The children will be awake soon. If you intend to stay, there's work to be done." It wasn't quite an invitation and wasn't quite a challenge, but something that existed in the space between the two. Ethan understood that this was a test, a chance for him to prove whether his words from the previous evening carried the weight of genuine intention or were just another set of empty promises. "What needs doing?" he asked, rolling up his sleeves despite the morning chill. What followed was the hardest physical labor Ethan had done since his days breaking horses in Texas, but also the most satisfying. Named had a dozen projects in various stages of completion, each one essential to her family's survival but requiring more hands than she possessed. The roof of the main house needed additional support beams to handle the weight of the canvas and salvaged wood she had used to make it weatherproof. Ethan found himself balanced on rickety ladders, holding timbers in place while Named secured them with rope and salvaged nails. The garden required expansion if it was to feed more than one family through the coming winter. They worked together to clear additional ground, removing rocks and desert debris while building up soil with ash from the fire and organic matter, carefully composted from kitchen scraps. Most challenging was the water situation. The creek that provided their primary water source ran strong during spring snowmelt, but became unreliable during the dry months. Named had identified a spot where they might dig a well, but the work required tools and expertise she didn't possess. Joseph was going to dig the well the spring after he died, she explained, as they examined the rocky ground she had selected.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
He said the water table ran close to the surface here, that we could reach it with hand tools if we were patient. Ethan knelt and examined the soil, using knowledge gained from years of ranch work to assess the site. The ground showed signs of subsurface moisture, and the vegetation pattern suggested water within 20 feet of the surface. We'll need to build a windlass to haul out the dirt and rock, he said, his mind already working through the engineering challenges. And we'll need timber for shoring up the sides as we dig deeper. For the first time since he had arrived, Namid smiled with something approaching genuine warmth. You know something about well digging. I've dug a few, Ethan admitted. It's honest work that pays well when you find water and teaches patience when you don't. As the morning progressed and the children woke to join the work, Ethan found himself settling into rhythms that felt more natural than anything he had experienced in years of drifting. Tala proved to have inherited her mother's practical intelligence, anticipating needs and solving problems with the creativity of someone who had learned to make much from little. The two boys, Chaitan and Mika, brought enthusiasm that more than compensated for their limited strength. They carried water, sorted salvaged materials, and provided the kind of cheerful commentary that made hard work feel like shared adventure. Are you going to live here now? Mika asked as he helped Ethan carry stones for a retaining wall they were building around the expanded garden. It was the question Ethan had been avoiding, the decision that would determine not just his own future, but the future of this family that had already endured more upheaval than any people should have to face. I don't know yet, he answered. Honestly, because these children deserve truth even when it was uncertain. But I'm here now, and there's work to be done, so that's what we'll focus on. Mika nodded with the acceptance of someone accustomed to taking life one day at a time. Mama says tomorrow will take care of itself if we do good work today. It was wisdom that Ethan wished he had learned earlier in life. The understanding that meaning came not from grand plans, but from daily choices to build rather than destroy, to help rather than hinder, to stay rather than run when things became difficult. They were taking a midday rest in the shade of the Ramada when the rider appeared on the ridge above their homestead. Ethan spotted him first, a lone figure on horseback silhouetted against the cloudless sky, too distant to identify but close enough to represent potential trouble. Namid followed his gaze and immediately moved toward the house where she kept a rifle hidden beneath loose floorboards. Her children gathered around her with the automatic response of people who had learned that strangers often brought danger rather than opportunity. Do you know him? Ethan asked, shading his eyes with his hand as he tried to make out details. That distance obscured. In this country, strangers are guilty until proven innocent, Namid replied, checking the load in her rifle with practiced efficiency. Too many Apache families have disappeared after visits from men they didn't recognize. The rider began his descent toward their homestead, picking his way carefully down the rocky slope with the skill of someone accustomed to difficult terrain. As he drew closer, Ethan could see that he was a white man, middle-aged, wearing the kind of practical clothing that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. Government man, Tala said quietly, her voice carrying the distrust of someone who had learned to associate official visitors with family disruption. But as the rider approached their yard, Ethan realized this wasn't a territorial official or military representative. The man's clothing was worn and practical. His horse was a working animal rather than a government mount, and his posture carried none of the rigid authority that characterized men who derived power from badges and official documents. Hello. The house, the stranger called, stopping his horse at a respectful distance and keeping his hands visible on the reins. I'm looking for the Strong Beer family, Namid stepped forward, her rifle held ready but not yet aimed at the visitor. I am Namid Strongbeer. These are my children. State your business. The stranger dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He was perhaps 50 years old, weathered by sun and wind, with the kind of lean build that came from years of physical labor rather than deliberate exercise. "My name is Thomas Whitehawk," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "I served with your husband in Captain Morrison's scout company. I have news that you need to hear." The tension in Named's posture shifted, but didn't disappear entirely. She had learned to be wary of men who claimed connection to her dead husband, particularly when that connection involved military service that had complicated their family's legal status. "What news?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Thomas looked around at the rebuilt homestead, taking in the evidence of months of hard work and determination. His expression showed approval mixed with something that might have been admiration. "The territorial government has been reviewing the cases of Apache scouts who died in service," he said. "There's been pressure from Washington to honor the promises made to families like yours." He reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather portfolio, handling it with the care due to important documents. "Joseph's service record has been reinstated. Your land grant has been approved and certified. This property legally belongs to you and your children." The words hit the assembled group like physical blows. Named actually staggered, reaching out to steady herself against a fence post, as the magnitude of what Thomas had said sank in. "Legal ownership?" she whispered, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might cause the miracle to evaporate. Thomas nodded, opening the portfolio to reveal official documents bearing territorial seals and signatures. "Full title, registered in your name as Joseph's widow and heir. 40 acres, mineral rights included, with federal protection against seizure or forced sale." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath his feet as he realized what this meant for his own tenuous claim to the property. The deed in his pocket, purchased for 5 cents at a government auction, was suddenly worthless paper. The territorial authorities had sold him land they didn't actually own, property that belonged to the family he had found living there. "There's more," Thomas continued, his weathered face showing genuine pleasure at delivering good news to people who had received precious little of it. "The federal government is offering compensation for families who suffered losses due to administrative errors. There's money available for rebuilding, for improvements, for establishing the kind of homestead Joseph envisioned for his children." Tala whooped with joy, a sound of pure celebration that echoed off the surrounding hills. The boys danced around their mother, whose stoic composure finally cracked to reveal tears of relief and vindication. But Ethan found himself stepping back from the celebration, understanding that this miracle for the Strong Beer family represented the end of his own desperate dream. He had spent his last money on land that wasn't legally available for purchase, and now he was back where he started, a drifter with no prospects and no place to call home. Named must have seen something in his expression, because she looked up from the documents Thomas was explaining and searched his face with eyes that had learned to read pain, even when people tried to hide it. "This changes things," she said quietly, her voice carrying both joy for her family's security and something that might have been regret for his situation. Ethan nodded, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack his face. "It changes everything. Your family is safe now. That's what matters." But as Thomas continued explaining the legal implications and financial opportunities that came with federal recognition of the Strong Beer family's claim, Ethan found himself wondering if there might still be room in this miracle for a man who had nowhere else to go. The question was whether Named would choose to remember his help during her time of need, or whether legal ownership would change her perspective on sharing her family's good fortune with a stranger who had briefly shared their struggle. 3 days after Thomas Whitehawk delivered the miracle of legal ownership, another visitor arrived at the Strong Beer homestead. But this one came with 6 armed men and the kind of cold authority that turned miracles into nightmares. Sheriff Clayton Morse rode at the head of the group, his badge catching the morning sun like a warning signal. Behind him came men that Ethan recognized as the type who made their living from other people's misfortune. Claim jumpers, hired guns, and the kind of legal vultures who circled around disputed property like buzzards waiting for something to die. Namid stepped out of the house with her rifle in hand, but the odds were overwhelmingly against her. 7 armed men against 1 Apache woman and a drifter with questionable legal standing represented the kind of mathematics that ended badly for the outnumbered. "Mrs. Strongbeer," Sheriff Morse called out, his voice carrying the false politeness of a man delivering bad news with a smile. "I'm afraid there's been a complication with your property situation." Ethan moved to stand beside Namid, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol despite knowing that drawing it would likely mean death for everyone on the homestead. Sometimes a man had to be willing to die for what was right, even when the odds made survival unlikely. "What kind of complication?" Namid asked, her voice steady despite the fear that Ethan could see in the way she held her shoulders. Sheriff Morse dismounted and approached them with the swagger of a man accustomed to having legal authority backed by superior firepower. He pulled a rolled document from his saddlebag, handling it with the ceremony due to official paperwork. "It seems there was an error in the federal review process," he said, unrolling what appeared to be another set of legal documents. "The land grant that Mr. Whitehawk delivered has been revoked pending further investigation into your husband's service record." The words hit like physical blows. Ethan watched Namid's face go pale as she realized that the miracle of 3 days ago was being transformed into another nightmare of bureaucratic manipulation. "That's impossible," she said, her voice carrying the desperate edge of someone watching their last hope disappear. "Thomas showed us the official documents. They bore federal seals, proper signatures. Joseph's service was verified." One of the men behind the sheriff laughed, a sound as ugly as a crow's caw. Ethan recognized him as Marcus Webb, a territorial land speculator who made his fortune by manipulating legal loopholes and exploiting the desperation of families like the Strongbeers. "Federal seals can be forged," Webb said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had orchestrated this reversal. "Service records can be altered. It's amazing how creative desperate people become when they're trying to steal land that doesn't belong to them." Ethan felt rage building in his chest like a prairie fire, the kind of anger that made men do stupid things that got them and everyone around them killed. But before he could act on that fury, Namid placed a restraining hand on his arm. "What do you want?" she asked Sheriff Morse, her voice carrying the weary resignation of someone who had fought this battle too many times before. The sheriff smiled, but it was the kind of expression that belonged on a snake rather than a human face. "Mr. Webb here has made a generous offer to purchase this property for fair market value. You'll have enough money to relocate your family somewhere more suitable for Apache families." It was extortion disguised as generosity, the kind of legal theft that used official documents and badges to accomplish what armed robbery achieved. More honestly, Ethan realized that Webb had probably orchestrated the entire sequence of events, from the false hope of federal recognition to this moment of forced sale. "And if we refuse?" Namid asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Webb stepped forward, his expensive clothes and soft hands marking him as a man who paid others to do his dirty work. "Then Sheriff Morse will be forced to evict you for trespassing on territorial land. Your children will be placed in the care of the Bureau of Indian Affairs until suitable arrangements can be made." The threat was clear and devastating. Not only would Namid lose her home, but her children would be taken from her and placed in government schools, designed to strip away their Apache identity and culture. It was a fate that many Apache families considered worse than death. "How much time do we have to decide?" Ethan asked, surprising everyone including himself by inserting himself into negotiations that didn't technically concern him. "Sheriff?" Morse studied him with the calculating gaze of a man trying to determine whether he represented a threat or merely an inconvenience. "You're the fellow who bought this land at auction, aren't you?" "Cooper, wasn't it?" "Ethan Cooper," he confirmed, understanding that his legal position was about to become relevant in ways he hadn't anticipated. Webb's eyes lit up with the kind of predatory interest that suggested he saw opportunity in every crisis. "Mr. Cooper, as the legal purchaser of this property, you have certain rights that supersede any claims based on forged documents." It was a devil's bargain wrapped in legal language. Webb was offering to recognize Ethan's dubious claim to the property in exchange for his cooperation in forcing out the Strong Beer family. He would get the land he had paid for, and Webb would get the clear title he needed for whatever development scheme he had planned. "I paid 5 cents for this land," Ethan said slowly, his mind racing through the implications of what was being offered. "According to you, that makes me the rightful owner." "Exactly," Webb said, his smile growing wider. "And as the rightful owner, you have every legal right to evict unauthorized occupants and take possession of your property." Namid looked at Ethan with an expression that mixed hope and despair in equal measure. She understood that he held the power to save or destroy her family, and that his decision would determine whether her children grew up free or became wards of a government that saw them as problems to be solved rather than people to be protected. The silence that followed. Webb's proposal stretched like a rope under tension, ready to snap and lash everyone within reach. Ethan could feel the weight of 7 pairs of eyes watching him, waiting to see whether he would choose personal gain or moral conscience. The smart play was obvious. Accept Webb's offer, claim legal ownership of the property, and evict the Strong Beer family with the backing of territorial law. He would finally have the home he had been searching for. And if an Apache widow and her children suffered in the process, well, that was just the cost of doing business in Arizona territory. But as Ethan looked at Tyla, Chayton, and little Mika huddled behind their mother, he found himself remembering other children he had known. Orphans created by Apache raids, Mexican families displaced by Anglo expansion, his own younger sister who had died of fever while his father searched for work that never paid enough to afford proper medicine. "Mr. Cooper," Webb pressed, his voice carrying the impatience of a man accustomed to quick decisions and profitable outcomes. "This is a generous offer. You could walk away from this situation with clear title to valuable land and enough money to develop it properly." Ethan turned to study the homestead that Namid had rebuilt from ashes and determination. The garden that fed her children, the house that sheltered them from desert storms, the well they had started digging together just that morning. Everything that mattered was here, built by hands that had never known the luxury of giving up. "What exactly are you offering me?" he asked, not because he was tempted, but because he needed to understand the full scope of Webb's corruption. Webb's smile revealed teeth like yellowed ivory. $5,000 cash, plus a partnership interest in the development company. "I'm forming. This land sits on a natural transportation route between Tucson and the mining districts. With proper development, it could support a town, maybe even a railroad depot." It was more money than Ethan had ever imagined possessing. Enough to buy his own ranch somewhere else. Enough to live comfortably for years without working another day of hard labor. All he had to do was sign papers that would destroy the lives of 4 people who had trusted him with their survival. "And the Strong Beer family?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Will be relocated to San Carlos Reservation where they can receive proper care and education," Sheriff Morse answered, his tone suggesting this was a generous solution rather than a slow-motion death sentence. Namid's face went gray as ash at the mention of San Carlos. Ethan knew enough about reservation conditions to understand why overcrowding, inadequate food supplies, disease, and the systematic destruction of Apache culture in the name of assimilation. "Mama," Mika whispered, tugging at his mother's skirt with the confusion of a 5-year-old who didn't understand why adults were discussing his family's fate as if they weren't standing right there. The sound of that small voice cut through Ethan's internal debate. Like a knife through canvas. He knelt down to Mika's eye level, seeing in the boy's face an innocence that the world was preparing to crush with bureaucratic efficiency. "Don't worry, little man," he said quietly. "Everything's going to be fine." When Ethan stood and turned back to face Webb and Sheriff Morse, his expression had hardened into something that made the hired guns behind them shift nervously in their saddles. "I appreciate your generous offer, Mr. Webb," he said, his voice carrying a deceptive calm that made Namid look at him with sudden attention. "But I'm afraid I'll have to decline." Webb's confident smile flickered like a candle in a strong wind. "Mr. Cooper, I don't think you understand the situation. This is your only chance to benefit from your investment. Without my backing, your claim to this property is worthless." "Maybe," Ethan agreed, his hand dropping to rest casually on his gun belt. "But my claim isn't what's worthless here. It's your assumption that every man has a price." The tension in the yard ratcheted up several notches as the hired guns realized this wasn't going to be the easy intimidation they had been paid to provide. Sheriff Morse placed his hand on his pistol grip, but Ethan had already calculated angles and cover, the kind of tactical thinking that had kept him alive through years of dangerous work. "You're making a mistake," Sheriff Morse warned, his voice carrying the authority of a badge backed by territorial law. "I can arrest you for interfering with official business." "On what charge?" Ethan asked, genuinely curious about the legal creativity required to justify arresting a man for refusing to evict people from his own property. The question caught Morse off guard, revealing that his authority was more bluster than substance. Webb stepped forward to fill the gap, his face flushed with the anger of a man whose carefully orchestrated plan was falling apart. "You have no idea who you're opposing," Webb snarled, his mask of civilized politeness finally slipping to reveal the predator underneath. "I have connections in Tucson and Washington. I can make your life very difficult." Ethan smiled, but it was the expression of a man who had already lost everything that mattered and therefore had nothing left to fear. "Mr. Webb, my life has been difficult since the day I was born. You'll have to try harder than threats to scare me." As Webb's group rode away with promises of legal retaliation and bureaucratic warfare, Ethan found himself standing in the yard with the Strong Beer family, all of them understanding that he had just declared war on forces far more powerful than a handful of Apache refugees and a broke drifter. "You didn't have to do that," Namid said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You could have taken their money and walked away rich." Ethan picked up a stone from the ground and threw it at a fence post, watching it bounce off the weathered wood with a sharp crack. "My father used to say that a man's character isn't measured by what he'll do for money, but by what he won't do for any amount of money." Tala stepped forward with the directness that had characterized all her interactions with him. "What happens now? Will they come back with more men?" It was a fair question from someone who had learned that adult promises often proved hollow when tested by superior force. Ethan considered lying, offering reassurances that would comfort her in the short term, but decided that this family had earned the truth. "Probably," he admitted. "Webb isn't the kind of man who accepts defeat gracefully. He'll find another way to get what he wants, and it probably won't involve giving us a choice next time." Namid nodded grimly, her expression showing that she had expected this answer. "Then we need to prepare. Joseph always said that the best defense against a superior enemy is to make the cost of victory higher than they're willing to pay." What followed was the most intensive period of preparation Ethan had ever experienced outside of actual war. Namid revealed depths of tactical knowledge that surprised him, understanding of defensive positions and supply management that suggested her late husband had shared more than domestic responsibilities with her. They moved the family's most precious possessions to hidden caches in the surrounding hills, places where children could survive for days if the homestead became untenable. Food, water, ammunition, and the few family heirlooms that connected the children to their Apache heritage were distributed among several secure locations. The house itself was fortified with materials salvaged from the fire damage. Windows were narrowed to provide better defensive positions while maintaining sight lines that covered all approaches. The well they had been digging was accelerated to completion, ensuring a water supply that couldn't be cut off by enemies controlling the creek. Most importantly, Namid began teaching Ethan the details of Apache warfare that her husband had learned during his years as a military scout. How to read tracks and signs that revealed enemy movements. How to use the desert terrain for concealment and tactical advantage. How to fight outnumbered and win through superior knowledge of the ground. The Apache way is not to meet superior force with force, she explained, as they practiced moving silently through the rocky hills around their homestead. It is to strike where the enemy is weak, retreat before they can respond, and make them pay so dearly for small victories that they eventually decide the war isn't worth fighting. It was guerrilla warfare adapted to the high desert, the kind of fighting that had made Apache warriors legendary for their ability to hold off armies with nothing but intimate knowledge of their homeland and absolute determination to never surrender. Ethan found himself learning not just tactical skills, but also a different way of thinking about conflict and survival. Where his background had taught him to solve problems through direct confrontation or strategic retreat, Apache warfare was about patience, persistence, and making every engagement cost the enemy more than they gained. Webb has money and legal authority, Namid said as they sat around their evening fire, planning defensive strategies by the light of stars that seemed close enough to touch. But this is our land, our home. We know every rock, every hiding place, every trail. That knowledge is worth more than all his hired guns. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the desert night. Not close enough to represent immediate danger, but near enough to suggest that violence was spreading through the territory like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. It's starting, Tala said quietly, her young face showing the grim acceptance of someone who had learned that peace was always temporary in Apache country. Ethan checked the load in his rifle and settled back against his bedroll, but sleep would not come easily tonight. Somewhere in the darkness, Marcus Webb was planning his next move, and morning would bring new challenges that would test everything they had learned about fighting for something worth dying to protect. The war for the Strongbeer homestead was about to begin in earnest, and Ethan Cooper found himself wondering if his decision to stand with this Apache family would prove to be the last choice he would ever make. But as he listened to the quiet breathing of children who trusted him to help protect their home, he realized that some decisions were worth dying for, regardless of the odds. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight he was exactly where he belonged, standing guard over people who had become more than allies. They had become family, and family was worth fighting for against any odds. The attack came at 3 in the morning, when the desert cold was deepest and human vigilance was at its lowest ebb. Ethan woke to the sound of horses moving carefully through the rocky terrain around their homestead, the muffled clatter of hooves on stone that spoke of riders trying to approach without being heard. He rolled silently from his bedroll and crawled to the window that offered the best view of the approaches to their fortified position. In the starlight, he could make out the shapes of at least 12 mounted men spreading out to surround the house, their movements coordinated with the precision of soldiers rather than the random violence of raiders. Namid appeared beside him like a ghost, her rifle already in her hands and her face painted with the kind of calm determination Ethan had seen on veteran soldiers before major battles. She had awakened her children and moved them to the reinforced root cellar they had prepared for exactly this situation. Webb didn't waste any time, she whispered, her voice barely audible even to Ethan, who was inches away. He's brought enough men to overwhelm us through sheer numbers. Through the narrow window, Ethan could see the attackers taking positions behind whatever cover the rocky terrain provided. They moved with the confidence of men who believed they held overwhelming advantages in both numbers and firepower, but they had underestimated both the defensive preparations that had consumed the past week and the fighting spirit of people who had nowhere left to retreat. The homestead had been transformed into a fortress designed to make every foot of ground cost the attackers dearly. "They'll try to burn us out," Namid predicted, her tactical knowledge proving accurate as several of the raiders began preparing torches from materials they had brought with them. Fire is the quickest way to force defenders from strong positions. It was a logical strategy that took advantage of the homestead's greatest vulnerability. The rebuilt structures were largely wood and canvas, materials that would burn quickly.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
And create smoke that could suffocate the defenders even if the flames didn't reach them. The first torch arced through the darkness like a falling star, landing on the roof of the main house where it immediately began to spread flames across the canvas and salvaged wood that had been used to patch the fire damage. Within minutes, the entire structure was beginning to burn with the hungry crackle of dry materials meeting open flame. "Now," Namid said quietly, and both she and Ethan opened fire simultaneously from their prepared positions. The rifle shots shattered the desert silence like thunder, followed immediately by screams of pain and surprise from attackers who had not expected such accurate return fire from a homestead they assumed would be defended by an Apache widow and a drifting cowboy. Ethan's first shot took down a raider who was preparing to throw another torch, sending the man tumbling from his horse with a cry that echoed off the surrounding hills. Namid's rifle spoke a split second later, and another attacker discovered that Apache women could shoot as accurately as any cavalry soldier. The coordinated assault immediately began to fall apart as the raiders realized they were facing prepared defenders in fortified positions rather than helpless victims. Men who had been confident in their numerical superiority suddenly found themselves exposed to rifle fire from concealed positions they couldn't identify. "Keep moving," Ethan called to Namid as he rolled away from his firing position and crawled toward the next window they had prepared for exactly this purpose. "Don't give them a stationary target." The advice proved prescient as bullets began shattering the window where he had been firing, splinters of wood and glass filling the air where his head had been moments before. The attackers were learning to concentrate their fire, but they were still shooting at positions the defenders had already abandoned. From the cellar beneath the burning house, Ethan could hear the children following the instructions they had rehearsed, staying low, staying quiet, and staying ready to move to the secondary position if the main house became untenable. Another torch landed near the well they had spent so much effort completing, but this one fell short of any flammable materials and guttered out harmlessly in the rocky soil. The raiders were becoming more cautious as their easy victory transformed into a costly assault against determined resistance. 20 minutes into the fight, the tactical situation began to shift in ways that neither side had anticipated. The fire consuming the main house had spread to create a wall of flame and smoke that actually provided concealment for the defenders, while illuminating the attackers who were silhouetted against the blaze. Ethan had moved to a position behind the stone wall of the garden, using gaps between rocks to fire at raiders who thought the growing fire would force the defenders to abandon their positions. Instead, the flames created a hellish backdrop that turned every muzzle flash from the attackers into a target beacon. "Two down on the north side," Namid called from her position near the well, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a marksman who had found her range. "They're starting to pull back from the open ground, but the retreat was tactical rather than complete." The raiders were regrouping behind better cover, and Ethan could see them preparing for a more coordinated assault that would take advantage of their superior numbers. That's when the unexpected reinforcements arrived. The sound of additional gunfire came from the ridge above the homestead, but these shots were aimed at the attackers rather than the defenders. Muzzle flashes lit up the rocky slopes as unseen rifles began picking off raiders from elevated positions that commanded the entire battlefield. "Apache warriors," Namid said with fierce pride, recognizing the tactical signatures of fighters, trained in the traditional warfare of her people. "Word of our fight has reached the free bands in the mountains." The psychological impact on the raiders was immediate and devastating. Men who had signed up to intimidate an isolated family suddenly found themselves caught between defensive fire from the homestead and sniper fire from the hills. Facing the prospect of fighting Apache warriors on their own terrain, several of the hired guns immediately broke and ran, abandoning their horses and equipment in their haste to escape what had become a trap rather than an easy victory. Others tried to maintain their positions, but found themselves exposed to crossfire from multiple directions. Marcus Webb's voice could be heard above the gunfire, screaming orders and threats at men who were more interested in survival than in earning their pay. His carefully planned assault was disintegrating into chaos as superior numbers proved useless against superior tactics and terrain knowledge. "Press the attack," Named called, rising from cover to advance on raiders who were beginning to panic. "Make them pay for every step they took toward our home." Ethan followed her lead, using the confusion created by the Apache fighters to close the distance with attackers, who were no longer able to maintain coordinated defensive positions. His rifle work was steady and accurate, each shot carefully aimed at men who had come to destroy everything he had learned to value. The battle was turning into a rout as the surviving raiders realized they were outmatched and outfought by defenders who knew the ground and had nowhere to retreat. The easy money they had been promised was turning into the hardest fight of their lives. By dawn, the shooting had stopped and the smoke was beginning to clear, revealing the full extent of both the victory and its price. 7 of Webb's raiders lay dead among the rocks, while 5 others had been wounded badly enough to require medical attention they weren't likely to receive in the middle of the desert. The Apache warriors who had provided crucial support began melting back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared, their intervention complete and their message delivered. This was still Apache land, and those who threatened Apache families would face Apache justice, but the homestead had paid a heavy price for its successful defense. The main house was a total loss, reduced to ash and blackened stone by the fire that had consumed everything the family had rebuilt after the first blaze. Months of careful work and precious resources had been destroyed in a single night. Ethan helped Namid and her children emerge from the cellar that had protected them during the battle, their faces smudged with smoke and their eyes wide with the realization of how close they had come to losing everything. "Is it over?" Mika asked, his small voice carrying the uncertainty of a child who had learned that safety was always temporary. "For now," Namid answered honestly, surveying the destruction with the stoic acceptance of someone who had rebuilt from ashes. Before and understood she might have to do it again. Among the debris left by the fleeing raiders, Ethan found evidence that this had been more than a simple intimidation attempt. Surveying equipment, maps marked with lot lines and development plans, and correspondence that revealed the full scope of Webb's ambitions for the land. "He wants to build a town here," Ethan said, studying papers that outlined plans for a railroad depot, mining support facilities, and the kind of commercial development that would transform the entire region. "This isn't just about one homestead. It's about controlling the transportation route between Tucson and the mining districts." The revelation explained the intensity of Webb's efforts and suggested that the night's battle was only the opening. Engagement in a larger conflict. Men with that much money at stake wouldn't be deterred by a single military defeat. Namid examined the surveying equipment with the interest of someone who understood its implications. "They've been planning this for months, maybe years. The fire that destroyed our house the first time, the government's refusal to honor Joseph's land grant, even the auction where you bought the property. All of it was designed to clear this land for development. It was a conspiracy that reached into the territorial government itself." involving officials who were supposed to protect families like the Strong Beers, but instead had been working to dispossess them for the benefit of wealthy speculators. What do we do now? Tala asked, her 12-year-old pragmatism cutting through adult speculation to focus on immediate survival needs. We have no house, winter is coming, and they'll be back with more men. The question hung in the morning air like smoke from the smoldering ruins of their home. They had won a battle but remained outnumbered and outgunned in a war that showed no signs of ending. The answer came from an unexpected source. As the family stood among the ruins of their home, trying to decide their next move, a lone rider approached from the direction of Tombstone. But this wasn't another of Webb's hired guns or a territorial official bringing more legal complications. Thomas Whitehawk dismounted near the smoldering remains of the house, his weathered face showing anger at the destruction and determination to make things right. He carried saddlebags that looked heavy with more than just personal supplies. I heard the shooting from 10 miles away, he said without preamble. Came as fast as I could, but it looks like you handled things without my help. Namid embraced the older Apache man with the relief of someone greeting family after a dangerous separation. Thomas had been Joseph's closest friend in the Cavalry Scouts, the man who had delivered news of the federal land grant that had briefly promised security. Webb's people burned us out, she explained, gesturing toward the destruction around them. But we drove them off with help from the mountain bands. Thomas nodded grimly, unsurprised by either the attack or the assistance. I've been investigating Webb's operation since I left here last week. What I found is bigger than anyone imagined. He opened his saddlebags to reveal not just official documents, but also photographic evidence, financial records, and correspondence that painted a picture of corruption reaching from Arizona territory to Washington, D.C. Webb isn't just a land speculator, Thomas explained, spreading papers on a flat rock that served as an impromptu table. He's the front man for a railroad syndicate that's been buying up land along the proposed southern route to California. They've been using territorial officials to dispossess Apache families and claim their land for development. The photographs showed surveyor camps, railroad equipment, and construction materials that had been secretly positioned throughout the region. What had appeared to be random attacks on Apache homesteads was actually a coordinated campaign to clear land for a transportation corridor that would be worth millions. The federal government doesn't know about the conspiracy. Thomas continued. The land grants for Apache scouts were legitimate, but territorial officials have been blocking their implementation while working with Webb to steal the property. Ethan studied the evidence with growing understanding of the forces they had been fighting. This wasn't just about one family's homestead, but about the systematic theft of Apache lands under the cover of legal bureaucracy. Can you prove this in court? He asked, though he suspected that courts controlled by the same territorial officials who were part of the conspiracy would provide little justice. Thomas smiled, but it was the expression of a man who had spent years learning to outmaneuver corrupt officials through superior knowledge and careful planning. Better than that, I can prove it to the federal investigators who are already looking into irregularities in territorial land management. He produced a telegram from his coat pocket, the official message forms bearing the seal of the Department of the Interior. Federal investigators were en route to Arizona territory to examine complaints about the treatment of Apache families and the administration of land grants. Webb's attack on your family was a mistake, Thomas explained. It provided the evidence. Federal investigators needed to justify a full investigation into territorial land management. They'll be here within the week. The news transformed the tactical situation from desperate defense to strategic opportunity. If they could survive until the federal investigators arrived, they would have a chance to expose the entire conspiracy and secure not just their own land, but the rights of every Apache family that had been victimized by Webb's scheme. 1 week, Namid said quietly, looking around at the ruins of her home and calculating. what it would take to protect her family for 7 more days without shelter or supplies. "We can hold out for 1 week," but even as she spoke, dust clouds on the southern horizon suggested that Webb was already organizing his response to the night's defeat. The real battle for the Strongbeer homestead was just beginning. With their main house reduced to ash and federal investigators still 5 days away, the Strongbeer family and Ethan faced their greatest challenge yet: surviving Webb's inevitable counterattack while exposed to the harsh desert elements that could kill as efficiently as any bullet. The Mid made the decision that would define their final stand. Instead of retreating to the mountains where they might survive, but lose their legal claim to the land, she chose to build their defense around the stone foundation of the burned house and the partially completed well that represented their only reliable water source. "We make our stand here," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of a war chief planning the defense of sacred ground. "If we abandon this place, Webb wins regardless of what the federal investigators discover. Apache families who run from their land lose the right to call it home." What followed was the most intensive construction project any of them had ever undertaken, as they raced to build fortifications that could protect a family against professional killers while using only materials that could be scavenged from the surrounding desert. Ethan found himself learning construction techniques that Apache warriors had developed over centuries of defensive warfare. How to build walls from loose stone that would stop bullets but remain invisible to distant observers. How to create firing positions that provided cover while maintaining clear fields of fire. How to dig interconnected trenches that allowed defenders to move without exposing themselves to enemy marksmen. The children proved invaluable in this desperate construction, their small size allowing them to crawl through spaces that adults couldn't navigate while carrying supplies and ammunition to forward positions. Tala demonstrated an intuitive understanding of defensive architecture that surprised even her mother, suggesting improvements that would make their fortress nearly impregnable to conventional assault. "The rocks need to look natural," she explained as they positioned boulders to create concealed fighting positions. "If they look like fortifications, the attackers will know exactly where to aim. But if they look like part of the landscape, we can shoot from cover while they waste bullets on empty ground." By the end of the second day, they had transformed the burned homestead into a defensive complex that utilized every advantage the terrain offered. The stone foundation of the house became the command center, with tunnels connecting it to firing positions scattered throughout the rocky ground. The well provided water that couldn't be cut off by siege, while cached supplies ensured they could hold out for weeks if necessary, but Webb wasn't planning to give them weeks. On the morning of the third day, dust clouds on the horizon announced the approach of an army that dwarfed his previous assault force. Through field glasses borrowed from Thomas Whitehawk, Ethan counted at least 30 riders approaching their position, accompanied by 2 wagons that likely contained additional ammunition and supplies for an extended siege. Webb had learned from his previous defeat and was bringing overwhelming force to ensure no repeat of his humiliation, but numbers weren't his only advantage this time. Among the riders, Ethan recognized the blue uniforms of U.S. cavalry soldiers, their presence transforming what had been a private dispute into something approaching an official military action. "How did he get cavalry support?" Ethan asked Thomas, who was studying the approaching force with the practiced eye of a man who had spent years evaluating military threats. "Corruption reaches higher than we thought," Thomas replied grimly. "Someone in the territorial command structures providing military backing for Webb's operations. Those soldiers think they're conducting a legitimate action against Apache raiders." The presence of federal troops complicated their situation immeasurably. Defending against hired gunmen was one thing, but firing on U.S. soldiers could be construed as rebellion or terrorism, charges that would justify any level of retaliation. "They're flying a flag of truce," Namid observed, pointing to a white banner carried by a rider approaching the head of the main force. The rider proved to be a cavalry lieutenant who looked barely old enough to shave. his crisp uniform and nervous demeanor marking him as someone new to the frontier politics that had ensnared him in a conspiracy he probably didn't understand. "I'm Lieutenant Bradford, U.S. 10th Cavalry," he announced when he reached speaking distance. "I'm here to serve an eviction notice to the illegal occupants of this property and to assist in the enforcement of territorial law." Ethan stepped forward to respond, understanding that how he handled this moment could determine whether they faced a manageable siege or an overwhelming military assault. "Lieutenant, I'm Ethan Cooper, legal owner of this property by territorial deed. These people are my invited guests." The young officer looked confused, clearly expecting to find Apache raiders rather than a white landowner making legal claims. He consulted papers provided by Webb's representatives, documents that apparently painted a very different picture of the situation. "Sir, according to my orders, this property is occupied by hostile Apache forces who have been conducting raids against local settlements. I'm authorized to use whatever force is necessary to remove them." Thomas Whitehawk rode forward, his own military bearing and knowledge of Army protocol giving him authority that the young lieutenant couldn't ignore. "Lieutenant, I'm Thomas Whitehawk, former sergeant with the Apache Scouts. May I examine your orders?" What followed was a tense examination of documents that revealed the full scope of Webb's manipulation of military resources. The orders were legitimate, signed by a territorial commander, but based on completely fabricated intelligence reports about Apache raiding activity. "Lieutenant," Thomas said carefully, "these reports describe raids that never happened against settlements that don't exist. Someone has provided your command with false information to justify military action against peaceful families." The young officer's face showed the confusion of someone discovering that his first independent command was based on lies and manipulation. But before he could respond, Webb himself rode up with several of his hired gunmen, his presence transforming the negotiation into a confrontation. "Lieutenant Bradford," Webb said, with the authority of a man accustomed to giving orders to military officers, "these people are trying to confuse you with legal technicalities. Your orders are clear. Remove the hostile Apache occupants by any means necessary." What happened next would become the defining moment of Lieutenant Bradford's military career. Faced with conflicting claims and evidence of manipulation, he had to choose between following orders that might be based on lies or conducting his own investigation into the true situation. "Mr. Webb," the lieutenant said slowly, "perhaps you could explain these discrepancies in the intelligence reports. This document describes a raid on Miller's Creek settlement, but my maps show no such place in this territory." Webb's face flushed with anger at being questioned by someone he obviously considered a subordinate. "Lieutenant, your job is to follow orders, not to conduct investigations. The Territorial Command has determined that these Apache families represent a threat to local security." But Thomas Whitehawk had spent years working with young cavalry officers, and he recognized the signs of someone beginning to question authority that might be corrupt. "Lieutenant, as a former military scout, I can verify that these families have never been involved in any hostile activity. The woman you're being asked to evict is the widow of Joseph Strongbeer, who died fighting alongside cavalry forces." The revelation that Nimid was a scout's widow hit the young officer like a physical blow. The U.S. Army had a strong tradition of protecting the families of soldiers who died in service, and the idea of evicting such a family troubled him deeply. "Mrs. Strongbeer," Lieutenant Bradford said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect, "I need to ask you some questions about these allegations of raiding activity." What followed was the most important interrogation of Named's life, as she answered questions that would determine whether her family faced military protection or military destruction. Her responses demonstrated not only her innocence of any hostile activity, but also her extensive knowledge of legitimate Apache families in the region. "Lieutenant," she said with quiet dignity, "every Apache family in these mountains has lost someone to this conflict. We want peace, not war. We want our children to grow up learning both Apache ways and American ways. The only raids we've seen are the attacks on our own families by men who want our land for profit. The young officer's questions became increasingly pointed as he realized the extent to which he had been manipulated into serving private interests rather than public security. His military training had taught him to recognize lies and manipulation, skills that were now being applied to the very orders he had been given. "Mr. Webb," Lieutenant Bradford said finally, his voice carrying new authority, "I'm suspending this operation pending an investigation into the intelligence reports that justified it. My soldiers will not participate in actions that may be based on fraudulent information." Webb's response was immediate and revealing. Instead of accepting the military decision with grace, he began making threats that exposed the full scope of his political connections and his expectation that territorial officials would override federal military authority. "Lieutenant, you're making a career-ending mistake," Webb snarled, his mask of civilized respectability finally falling away completely. "I have connections that reach to Washington. I can have you transferred to the worst posting in the Army before the week is out." But Lieutenant Bradford had been raised by a father who valued honor above advancement, and Webb's threats only strengthened his resolve to do what was right, regardless of personal consequences. "Mr. Webb, if my career depends on evicting innocent families based on false reports, then perhaps it's a career I don't want." The standoff between the young cavalry officer and Webb's forces created an opportunity that Thomas Whitehawk had been waiting for since arriving with evidence of the larger conspiracy. With military authority now questioning Webb's version of events, the time had come to reveal the full scope of the corruption that had victimized Apache families throughout the territory. "Lieutenant Bradford," Thomas said, "I have evidence that these eviction orders are part of a larger conspiracy involving territorial officials and private speculators. Would you be willing to examine documents that prove systematic fraud in land management?" What followed was a presentation that transformed understanding of the entire situation. Thomas spread out photographs, financial records, and correspondence that painted a picture of corruption reaching from local land offices to territorial command structures. The evidence showed that Webb's railroad syndicate had been systematically targeting Apache land grants, using territorial officials to block federal recognition, while forcing families off land that was then sold to private developers. The military orders against the Strongbeer family were just the latest example of government resources being used to serve private profit. "This is treason," Lieutenant Bradford said quietly, studying photographs that showed territorial officials meeting with railroad representatives while Apache families were being evicted from their homes, using military forces to conduct private evictions based on false intelligence reports. Webb realized that his carefully constructed conspiracy was falling apart as federal military authority aligned with the very families he had been trying to dispossess. His response was to abandon any pretense of legal authority and resort to the kind of direct threats that had always been his ultimate weapon. "You're all making a fatal mistake," he declared, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. "This land will be developed regardless of what federal investigators discover. There's too much money at stake to let a few Apache families and a bleeding heart lieutenant stand in the way." The threat of violence hung in the desert air like the smell of smoke from their burned house. Men on both sides began positioning themselves for what might become a gunfight between federal troops and private gunmen, a battle that could trigger the kind of regional conflict that would bring federal intervention on a massive scale. But before anyone could draw weapons, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of yet another group of riders. These came from the direction of Tombstone, riding hard and flying the kind of official banners that commanded immediate attention. "Federal marshals," Thomas Whitehawk said with satisfaction, recognizing the authority that trumped all territorial officials and private conspirators. "The investigation has arrived 3 days early." The lead marshal dismounted with the confidence of a man accustomed to arriving at complicated situations and sorting truth from lies with swift efficiency. He surveyed the scene with experienced eyes that took in everything from the burned homestead to the tense standoff between military and civilian forces. "I'm Marshal William Harrison, Department of Justice," he announced, his voice carrying federal authority that superseded all local jurisdictions. "We're here to investigate reports of systematic fraud in territorial land management and the illegal use of military resources for private gain." Webb's face went white as he realized that his worst nightmare had arrived ahead of schedule. The federal investigation he had been trying to prevent through intimidation and violence was now standing in front of him with full legal authority to examine every aspect of his operations. The siege of the Strong Bear homestead was about to become the least of Marcus Webb's problems, as federal justice finally caught up with a conspiracy that had victimized families throughout Arizona territory. But even as Marshal Harrison began taking statements and examining evidence, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Webb still had cards to play in this deadly game. Men with his level of political connections and financial resources rarely surrendered without exhausting every possible avenue of escape. The real test of whether justice would prevail was just beginning. Marshal Harrison's investigation moved with the efficiency of federal authority that had finally found clear evidence of the corruption it had been seeking. Within hours of his arrival, the marshal had documented enough evidence to justify arrests that would reach into the highest levels of territorial government, but Marcus Webb was not a man who surrendered easily. As federal marshals began cataloging evidence and taking statements from witnesses, Webb made a decision that would transform him from a corrupt businessman into something far more dangerous, a desperate criminal with nothing left to lose. "You think you've won," Webb told Marshal Harrison as the federal officer examined the railroad syndicate's correspondence. "But you have no idea how deep this goes. There are people in Washington who will never let this investigation see a courthouse." The threat was delivered with the confidence of a man who had spent years buying political protection and believed that enough money could corrupt any system. But Marshal Harrison had seen such confidence before, usually in men who were about to discover the limits of their political connections. "Mr. Webb," the marshal replied calmly, "this investigation has presidential authorization. The railroad scandals have become a national issue, and your territorial operations are part of a larger pattern we've been tracking across 3 territories." It was information that hit Webb like a physical blow, the realization that his local conspiracy had attracted attention at the highest levels of federal government. The systematic theft of Apache lands had become evidence in a case that threatened railroad fortunes and political careers throughout the Western territories. Webb's response revealed the true depth of his desperation. Instead of accepting arrest gracefully, he began making offers that exposed the full scope of his criminal network and his willingness to betray anyone to save himself. "I can give you names," he said urgently. "Territorial officials, military commanders, railroad executives. I have records of every payment, every favor, every illegal transaction. Immunity from prosecution in exchange for cooperation." But even as Webb negotiated with federal authorities, Ethan noticed that several of his hired gunmen had quietly positioned themselves around the perimeter of the homestead. Men who had been paid to fight were still prepared to earn their money, regardless of what legal arrangements their employer might make. "Marshal," Ethan said quietly, "Webb's men are still armed and positioned for trouble. I don't think he's planning to surrender peacefully." What happened next demonstrated the cunning that had made Webb successful in his criminal enterprises for so many years. While openly negotiating with federal marshals, he had been secretly signaling his gunmen to prepare for what amounted to a massacre designed to eliminate all witnesses to his crimes. The first indication of treachery came when one of Webb's men began moving toward the position where Named's children were sheltering. The movement was subtle, disguised as casual repositioning, but Ethan's experience with dangerous men allowed him to recognize the predatory approach. "They're going for the children," he warned Thomas Whitehawk. who immediately began moving to intercept the threat while staying low enough to avoid presenting a target. Webb's plan became clear with horrifying simplicity. Eliminate everyone who could testify against him, claim that Apache raiders had attacked the federal investigation, and use the chaos to escape with enough evidence destroyed to make prosecution impossible. "Now!" Webb shouted, and his gunmen opened fire simultaneously from their concealed positions. But Webb had underestimated both the defensive preparations that had been made over the past week and the combat experience of the people he was trying to kill. The fortress that Namad and Ethan had built from desert stone and Apache wisdom proved equal to this final assault. Federal marshals dove for cover behind the stone walls that had been carefully positioned to provide protection from exactly this kind of attack. Lieutenant Bradford's cavalry troopers, caught off guard by the sudden violence, quickly adapted to fighting alongside the very people they had originally been ordered to evict. "Protect the family," Marshal Harrison called to his men as bullets ricocheted off stone fortifications. "Whatever else happens, those children are under federal protection now." The battle that followed was unlike anything that had come before. Instead of a siege against an isolated homestead, this was urban warfare fought among the ruins of a home that had become a symbol of resistance against corruption and greed. Ethan found himself fighting beside Lieutenant Bradford, the young cavalry officer, proving that his moral courage was matched by physical bravery, as he used his military training to coordinate defensive fire against men who had betrayed everything. The uniform represented, "Cover the marshal," Bradford shouted as federal officers worked to secure evidence that Webb's men were trying to destroy. "That documentation is the key to prosecuting this entire conspiracy." The fighting was fierce but brief, as Webb's gunmen discovered that their opponents were no longer isolated defenders, but federal officers backed by cavalry troops and Apache fighters who materialized from the surrounding landscape like spirits of the desert seeking justice. One by one, Webb's hired guns fell or fled as they realized they were fighting not just for money, but against the combined forces of federal law enforcement and Apache warriors defending their ancestral lands. The easy victory Webb had planned became a disaster that left his criminal network exposed and his escape routes cut off. But the battle exacted its own price from those who fought for justice. Thomas Whitehawk took a bullet in the shoulder while protecting Namad's children, his sacrifice ensuring that the next generation of Apache families would grow up free from the fears that had haunted their parents. Lieutenant Bradford was wounded in the leg while charging a position that threatened to overwhelm the federal marshals, his actions proving that honor could triumph over political pressure when tested by genuine crisis. Most seriously, Ethan found himself face to face with Webb in the ruins of the stone foundation where the Strongbeer family had made their final stand. The confrontation between the drifter who had found his purpose and the businessman who had lost his soul would determine not just the outcome of this battle, but the future of Apache families throughout the territory. "You could have been rich," Webb snarled as they faced each other among the blackened stones of the burned house. "I offered you everything a man could want, and you threw it away for these people." "That's where you're wrong," Ethan replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had finally learned the difference between price and value. "You offered me everything a man could buy, but these people gave me everything a man could need." The gunfight between them was short and decisive. Webb had spent years paying others to fight his battles, while Ethan had spent a lifetime learning to survive by his own skill and courage. When the smoke cleared, Marcus Webb lay among the ashes of the dreams he had tried to destroy. 3 months after the battle that ended Webb's conspiracy, federal investigators had traced the corruption through 6 territorial governments and implicated railroad executives whose trials would dominate newspaper headlines for the next 2 years. The systematic theft of Apache lands became a national scandal that forced fundamental reforms in how the federal government managed Western territories. But for the Strongbeer family, the most important changes were measured in smaller, more personal terms. The insurance settlement from Webb's criminal enterprise provided enough money to rebuild their home properly, with stone walls that would withstand fire and time. More importantly, federal recognition of Apache land grants ensured that such rebuilding would never be necessary again. Ethan had used his share of the settlement to purchase additional land adjacent to the original homestead, creating a ranch large enough to support 2 families while maintaining the community that had developed around their shared struggle. The deed to this expanded property bore both his name and Named's, a legal recognition of the partnership that had saved them all. "It's not the house that makes a home," Named said as they stood watching the children play in the rebuilt garden, where they had once prepared for war. "It's the people who choose to stay when staying becomes difficult." The new house they built together incorporated both Apache architectural wisdom and frontier construction techniques, creating something that belonged fully to neither culture, but honored both. Wide porches provided shade from desert sun, while interior spaces maintained the privacy that Apache families valued. Most importantly, it included a large room specifically designed for the community gatherings that had become central to their IOST. Lev's Lieutenant Bradford, promoted for his role in exposing the territorial conspiracy, had been assigned to establish a new cavalry post that would protect Apache families from future exploitation. His friendship with Thomas Whitehawk had evolved into a partnership that bridged military and civilian interests in ways that benefited everyone involved. The Army is finally learning that Apache scouts and Apache families are valuable allies, rather than problems to be solved, Bradford explained during one of his regular visits to the homestead. "Your resistance to Webb's corruption proved that cooperation produces better results than intimidation." Thomas Whitehawk had recovered fully from his wounds and used his newfound influence to establish an advocacy organization that helped Apache families navigate federal bureaucracy and secure the rights they had been promised. His office was located in the territorial capital, but his heart remained with families like the Strongbeers, who had proven that courage could triumph over corruption. On the first anniversary of Ethan's arrival at the burnt homestead, entire extended community gathered for a celebration that honored both survival and renewal. Apache families from throughout the mountains came to share food and stories with cavalry officers, federal marshals, and territorial officials who had proven that government could serve justice rather than private interest. The occasion was officially the dedication of the new house, but everyone understood they were really celebrating something larger: the triumph of community over isolation, cooperation over exploitation, and moral courage over political expediency. Ethan found himself standing in the same spot where he had first encountered Namid and her children 18 months earlier. But instead of a burnt ruin occupied by desperate refugees, he now saw a thriving homestead that had become the center of a community spanning cultural and social boundaries. "Do you ever regret it?" Tala asked, approaching him with the directness that had characterized all her interactions with adults. At 13, she had grown into someone who understood that the choices adults made determined the world children inherited. "Regret what?" Ethan asked, though he suspected he knew what she meant. "Giving up the chance to be rich. Webb's offer would have made you wealthy enough to live anywhere, do anything. Instead, you chose to stay here and be poor with us." Ethan looked around at the celebration surrounding them, at children playing games that mixed Apache traditions with frontier innovations, at adults sharing stories and food in languages that honored different cultures but expressed universal values. "Tala," he said quietly, "I spent 27 years thinking that having more things would make me a better man. It took coming here to learn that being a better man makes everything you have more valuable." The girl nodded with the wisdom of someone who had learned early that external circumstances mattered less than internal choices. Joseph Strongbeer used to say that a man's wealth is measured by what he would fight to protect rather than what he owns. As the celebration continued into the desert night, with stars providing light for stories and songs that honored both Apache heritage and frontier determination. Athene realized that his 5-cent investment had earned returns that no financial calculation could measure. He had found a family, a community, and a purpose that transformed him from a drifter into someone who belonged. More importantly, he had learned that home wasn't a place you bought, but a life you built with people who chose to stay when staying became difficult. The burnt shack that had brought him here was long gone, replaced by something stronger and more beautiful. But the lesson it had taught remained. Sometimes the best investments can't be measured in dollars and cents only. In the lives they touch and the communities they create. In the end, Ethan Cooper had bought more than land for his 5 cents. He had purchased the chance to become the man he was always meant to be, in a place where courage mattered more than money and family was defined by choice rather than blood. The lonely rancher who had arrived with nothing but desperate hope had become a founding father of a community that would endure for generations, proving that sometimes the smallest investments yield the greatest returns when they're made with an open heart and an unbreakable will.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.